Good morning, everybody. We are so glad that you are joining us today to talk about foreign influence management. We do have an adjustment that we had to make for this presentation that we want to share with you up front, and that is that our federal partners who were expecting to today on for the webinar were pretty much at the last minute unable to attend. We think that they are caught up. They've shared with us they're caught up in a little bit with the transition issues and with guidance from their own agencies about what they are able to share and not share just at the moment with all of us. And so they asked over the weekend and yesterday to perhaps participate at a later time with us. And so we have necessarily needed to pivot this session. I hope what we are going to share with you today is going to still be of significant value to you on the foreign influence front. And I want to assure everyone on the webinar that this is merely a transition issue and a temporary issue. Our federal partners continue to be amazingly strong supporters and willing to work with us. And we're simply in a situation where they aren't able to do what they had hoped to do originally. But we'll see them again. Next slide. So we want to share with you what we are going to do today. And that is there's been a number of key developments in the foreign influence area in the last few months. And so we are going to go through and share some of those with you at summary level. And it'll help, I think, set the context a little bit for where we stand now and how things have evolved. So you can see the 4 things here that we have picked that we're going to be covering with you. And then we want to share with you something we were able to do with our federal partners from NIH and NSF a little more than a week ago, or about a week ago, and that relates to a particular topic within foreign influence about connecting the dots. And what we mean by that, you'll hear a lot about this, is how universities go together and are able to connect information within the institution that helps the federal agencies and helps us be able to appropriately manage foreign interference and the associated risks, and just frankly how difficult that can be sometimes. We want to make sure the federal agencies understand that. At the end of our time today, we're also then going to do some Q&A as well. Next slide. So you may recall seeing this slide before from us. This is one of the things we wanted to cover with all of you. But there's a difference in this slide for those of you sharp-eyed research administrators out there. You're going to see that there aren't links on the left-hand side. And that's because we have learned that some of the reports and some of the links we provided to you previously for how to get to this information apparently have moved and they're not at their original site. So this may be simply an indication that they are now being absorbed into the actual practical process of being able to use that information. You'll remember that Kelvin Drogemeyer, in his speech to the FDP in June, was really clear about defining the foreign influence problem for all of us. And we all really appreciated his clarity and succinct description of some of the issues and challenges that it has. But we were expecting 2 more chunks of things. One is we know that OSTP has been working hard on creating a set of harmonized actions for agencies to take on. And we know that they have been working on best practices for universities. We think all of that is still very much happening, and we're expecting to see the outcome of that, but we don't know the dates. We know that from this fall, Kelvin was hoping that it would be before the transition of leadership, but at this point, clearly that won't be happening. So we're just still waiting for information on that. But we expect that all of this great groundwork and homework that the federal agencies have been doing are actually going to be forthcoming either in an OSTP release or frankly, in just the actual implications of what we're going to see in terms of new and updated requirements. Next slide. So Jim's going to talk now a little bit about some other new things that have happened within the last few months since we've last talked to you. Jim?
Thanks, Pamela. Welcome, everyone. Jim Luther from Duke University. We appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. So you'll note these next 5 or 6 slides are very dense. We'll go through the highlights, but they're not designed for us to go into the nitty-gritty detail, but they certainly are things that you and your institution should be aware of. And so we felt like both for the context of the next discussion, as well as kind of your institutional preparedness, it was important for you all to be aware of these. And we often start with OSTP because they've done such a good job of kind of leading this issue through JCOR and other things. So that's why Pamela started with that. As we look at the NDAA, National Defense Authorization, the NDAA has been an interesting vehicle for lots of change oftentimes because it's often the one aspect of the budget that almost always is approved on a fairly timely basis. And so oftentimes there's other things injected in there. You may remember in the past, I think it was the Research Policy Board years ago that was in the NDAA. Recently, the NDAA 889 prohibited technology guidance was in there. Well, this year there's this Section 223. And the highlights of this are a desire for agencies to be more consistent about what needs to be disclosed in current and pending and other support. Comments on certification requirements, both from the individual as well as the entity perspective, and then some pretty significant language around enforcement. Again, we don't know how any of or all of this will be implemented. That will have to see agency by agency, but the fact that the NDAA includes this language is certainly driving towards kind of a more consistent way as to how the agencies are going to deal with it. Next slide, please. You may remember MITRE. They've been to many meetings, FTP meetings over the last couple of years and even longer. They presented to FTP 6 months or so ago about some work they were doing around this foreign influence space. And you can see at the top, their objective was to identify improper foreign influence risks, employ effective tools, and then take an integrative approach. And to do that, they met with a large number of individuals, different institutions. I think they met with Koger, with FTP leadership. I see Dick Seligman on here and others. They met with lots of individuals, both from their institutional perspective as well as their broader perspective from associations and so forth. And then the next, I think, 2 slides I have are just some of the principal findings and excerpts. I would say this report, we got MITRE's okay to present this report today. I think it'll be public and out on a website within the next couple of days. We'll find out if we can include it in advance in these materials. But I think in the next couple of days, if you Google the name of the report at the top, it'll come up. It's not out there yet, but it should be very, very soon. As you can see in the principal findings, I've underlined some of the key elements. Some of these are emphasizing things that we know already. That in 2018, August of 2018, when Dr. Collins sent out the communication, there was not a broad understanding of negative impacts of improper foreign influence. It probably took us 3, 6, 9 months to fully understand the expanse of it, but we all do now. And it's clear that the objectives of all the communications from all the agencies and the entities is that the value of international collaborations are at the forefront. So managing this risk has to be done in the context of making sure we don't disenfranchise these critical relationships. I think that 4th bullet, individual PIs continue to perceive a large gray area. I think that's the case for the PIs as well as those of us that try to manage this risk. Sometimes we see issues that are administrative oversights where we don't disclose a relationship. Sometimes there might be something more deliberate, and sometimes it might be criminal. In that continuum, there's a large gray area, and I think that's acknowledged in this report. And so there's a handful of other things that you can read at your leisure. And again, the report will have a great deal more background on that. Next slide, please. So from the standpoint, continuing on the MITRE report, there was a specific section about what we as academic stakeholders want. And if you remember at the last panel discussion that Pamela and I moderated several months ago, we did a thought exchange to get input from you all about what were the most critical things. And certainly consistent was one of the most critical issues, consistency across agencies. And this reinforces that, as well as timely access to data. So all in all, some aspects are reinforcing what we already know, and there are some new aspects. And then again, the recommended course of actions. I won't go into great detail, but I'll mention the top 2 items. There's a lot of discussion in the MITRE report about managing and understanding improper influence throughout the life cycle, not just at the origin of the proposal or other support in current and pending, not just at the progress report or final report, but throughout the life cycle. And the second is this concept of a risk reduction approach. You'll hear in the connecting the dots shortly that one of the white paper concepts that we have is that sometimes it doesn't always appear that there is a broad differentiation based on risk, and that puts sometimes the PI, the faculty member, and the institution at odds. And this concept of understanding risk reduction and risk mitigation, I think, is critical to that. Next slide, please. Moving briefly on to the GAO report. This came out within the last month, very heavily focused on COI. And you can see there in red, emphasizing kind of although there is an absence of agency-wide COI policies and definitions, there is guidance from many agencies on these topics. What this report is talking about, how to make it more consistently applied, how it's used in the grant proposal, and so forth. Next slide, please. These next 2 slides, I won't go into great detail at all. They're here just to highlight the conflict of commitment group that's led by Amanda and Alice. And these next 2 slides, they've already spent some time going into the GAO report to really understand what are the focuses, what are the issues, and what are the questions. And this is just to highlight what some of the topics they're looking at. And if you have interest, reach out directly to Amanda and Alice. And as you'd expect, there'll be lots of overlap between the Foreign Influence Working Group, of which you'll see the list of names here shortly, as well as some of the other committees, and certainly this conflict of commitment work group as well. Next topic. Next slide, please. And again, these are some of the continuing questions, again, that I won't go into. But again, if you have questions, please reach out to the points of contacts there. Next slide, please. Okay, Pamela, it's all yours. Thank you.
So we want to share with you today a really powerful session that we had a week ago or so with the federal agencies, specifically with NIH and NSF representatives, Jean Feldman, Michelle Bowles, and Rebecca Kaiser. That we were calling Connecting the Dots. And so the real point of this was, as you can see here, is to just alert NIH and NSF about the challenges that we have with gathering information and using information across our institutions. And so next slide. The way we went about this was a product of the FDP Foreign Influence Working Group, We go by FIG for short. The W is silent. Now that might be just so we could pronounce an acronym, but it's really just because we didn't want to tell everybody ahead of time how much work it was going to be in this working group. But they have really stepped up for this. And it's different than any other FTP group, because what we've done is be purposely cross-cutting across other major FTP committees, subcommittees, and working groups. And so you can see here the representatives from all those other groups that we brought together in one place with this idea then that we could be comprehensive and cross-cutting as we approach the topic. And this group has just in a major way stepped up. So as I said about this session is that we had our 3 federal partners from NIH and NSF. We were also lucky enough to invite and have Wendy Streitz from Koger join this meeting that we had last week as well. And next slide. And we really have been focusing a lot in in FIG about 2 major topics. And this was really the focus of this listening session, about how difficult is it for us to actually put all these puzzle pieces together within our organization. And we also needed to grapple with, and you'll see, we'll talk about it in detail here in a minute, just how difficult it is to understand roles and responsibilities. So what can and should an institution be responsible for throughout the life cycle of a sponsored project in terms of making sure that there's not undue foreign interference in an award? And what should an investigator personally be responsible for? So we've talked a lot also about what's realistic in terms of a time frame. How feasible is it for us to do this quickly? How feasible is it for us to do it within existing guidance, or what needs to change about guidance that would make it possible to do this well? Next slide. Jim?
Thanks, Pamela. So what do we mean by connecting the dots? We've had a version of this slide that we've used probably for 18 months now, 12 to 18 months, and it didn't have nearly as many dots to be connected until the last couple of months. But what this is meant to represent is that as we talk about foreign engagement or foreign influence, we're first of all really talking about those things in the middle box. What are those things that we can do to ensure that we protect national security, economic security, and the integrity of research? And then those things in red are the dots. Those are the things that we as institutions need to be aware of. And then the green is where we might have to report them. So again, we need to understand in-kind resources and foreign travel. We need to understand if individual faculty are communicating through the departmental annual review. Those are dots that somewhere might need to be reported in a programmatic report, and then other support in current and pending. And so as Pamela mentioned, the challenge here is in many cases, some of these data points are collected in siloed ways because they were never designed. They were never structured in a manner that we would have to connect them. And now we have to connect them. So when we say connecting the dots, these are the items that we're talking about as we go through it. Next slide, please. And then this is an excerpt from a Koger document that Koger put out in the last couple of months. And you don't really need to understand the details of it. This was used to tell the story to our federal partners, how diverse, complex, and broad some of these data elements are. So if you look at those yellow bars, what that means is for each of the areas, external activities, conflict of interest, and current and pending, the yellow bars are the number of institutions that have 5 or more units involved in the reporting. So again, that middle conflict of interest, of those surveyed, 58 of the total group had at least 5 offices involved in collecting, reviewing, implementing, and managing conflict of interest. So when we talk about these as dots or these as things that need to be disclosed. What it means is corralling a whole lot of people from many offices jointly to report these things. And one of the topics that we'll talk about here shortly is in a timely manner, right? Many of these things happen on a cycle that don't necessarily align with when a faculty member is submitting a proposal. They might be annual, they might be monthly, they might be as needed. And now, if a faculty member has a proposal going out next week, we have to connect those dots in a timely way to get that data out the door. So this is just to represent the breadth and the complexity of the data point collection process. Next slide, please. So here are the white paper topics that we, as a Foreign Influence Working Group, kind of pulled together to have the discussion with our federal partners. And so the first is understanding that institutions have different cultural challenges and different ways that we manage our business. The second is FCOI. There's a lot of sensitivity to that data, and thinking that we can make that readily available to a grant manager who's helping a faculty member submit has some complexities that we'll talk about. Number three, Pamela will be talking about this, just the inherent complexity of those dots and how to connect them. Number four, sometimes it may feel that we might be pitting the individual faculty member against the institution because of the approach and the guidance and the guidelines by which we implement research and kind of investigate these situations. Number five is technical barriers. We all have different levels and scales of systems. Some are paper, some are technical, some are 20-year-old systems, and some are brand new. And so there's challenges there. The faculty perspective is one that we touched on a little bit with the federal partners, but probably one of the most important ones on there. We can't win this battle, win this war of all the other items without making sure that the faculty understand and are full partners in this process. And then last, as Pamela opened up with, who is the accountable party in making sure that we accurately report this data? And so for each of the white papers, you can see on the right-hand side, we briefly created the issue and some background. We talked about the challenges and some recommendations. And then we went through each of these items with our federal partners a week or so ago. And today we want to provide the highlights and get your inputs as we go through each item. Next slide, please. And I think Kim Moreland is on point for this one. Kim, we can't hear you if you're talking. Okay, so I forget, Pamela, if we had a backup for this one, or we should, Kim, if you can join us, please. Okay,
Kim.
great. Thanks, Susan. If you can take point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Technology remains a challenge, and part, indeed, of the institutional and cultural challenges that you will hear about. I think of this first topic as one that really includes all of the others on the list. And it is how we assimilate the problems of dealing with these issues structurally across the multiple offices that are involved, and then making the cultural change to look at a time in which we might not be trusting the information we get from our faculty. So I want to talk about a few of these and then hand off for a moment to Susan Anderson to talk about a particular perspective she has. I think that we start with our difficulty when we look at the definitions of what needs to be reported, and certainly those are not cohesive. I think NIH and NSF have made good efforts, but what I get stuck on when I get to those two is their need for us to report all resources that support research or that are related to the research endeavor. The phrase related, of course, is a little in need of definition itself, but we are trying to find a way to report information that might be related to research endeavors that may not come through our institutions. And I am, of course, talking about consulting as well as other private arrangements between an investigator and a third party. Some institutions, in fact, do not see those consulting arrangements. I think that is by far the largest portion of it. Some explicitly do not wish to see those because they regard it outside the scope of the institution. That's a position that is, I think, now up for discussion. I want to point out, too, that in some instances, we have 9-month faculty who are very active researchers and who may have no obligations to the university during the summer, or at least for part of the summer. We are, however, now about to become responsible for knowing what arrangements they have, again, if those arrangements are related to research. That's a very difficult shift. Those shifts, in fact, may cause the need for us to look at our tenure requirements and at faculty governance relations that were built on old definitions of what research is and what faculty reporting responsibilities are. All of this falls under the very difficult umbrella that we have to understand what our obligations are to the funding agency and to our faculty itself, and to historic notions of governance that are now being shifted. The truth is we do not have policies and systems in place to manage these issues. Now, I can't deal with Jim's big chart with all of the dots that need to be connected, even though we do need to connect all those dots. So for me, I shift it down to look at it to sort of what I think of as the big four. You might have totally different four that are important, but I need to think of how can we connect information collected in a financial conflict of interest system, in a conflict of commitment system, in other support or current and pending support, and the fourth one for me is progress reports, because those are all disclosure mechanisms that have to be connected. And many of those other dots fall under those big buckets, I suppose is the word. So we need to think about how to do that. I want you to hear for just a minute Susan Anderson from College of Charleston, because she has some very specific instances in which this would be a challenge. Susan?
Thank you, Kim. So as Kim mentioned, I'm at the College of Charleston. It's a state institution in South Carolina, and we have about 10,000 undergrads, 1,500 master's students, and robust research, although much of our research is actually not externally funded. So we get about, I don't know, maybe $8 million worth of awards per year. So we're on the low end. That's why we're one of the emerging research institutions. But as a smaller institution in terms of research funding, we may have some advantages in this arena because we are extremely centralized, and like many of our fellow ERIs, there may be one person who is responsible for several aspects of what we're talking about today, or at least they may be one or two people in the same office. But even so, there are elements that we would not be aware of and that we would have difficulty accessing. And so even the name of our office is Research and Grants Administration. We really are only responsible for and aware of research that is externally funded or that has compliance aspects that our office is responsible for. So outside activities is a really good example, consulting or otherwise. Maybe our provost knows about these, wouldn't necessarily have intimate details about any of it, but might be aware of it, but there's no back communication channel from the provost's office to our office, even though we report to the provost's office. So that would be an area, for example, that we simply would not know about unless the faculty member or the researcher told us. And similarly, things like publications or other research activities, we would only indirectly know about, if at all. So one of the concerns that we would have is we don't have anything to check against or to look up. And that certainly is a problem that we share with all of you, because that's kind of what we're talking about today. So if we are responsible for catching all activity that might be relevant, we've got big holes. And the other aspect is, and Kim alluded to this, we need to be able to advise our researchers and our institutional administration on what needs to be done and how we would fulfill that role. So, and the culture issue, again, with tenure and promotion in particular, you know, the things that we've been encouraging that we now appear to possibly putting the brakes on, especially in the context of all of the disruptions that we've all undergone because of COVID, makes this a particularly sticky topic for us. Kim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Could I have the next slide, please? And this is recommendations. I suspect many of you would have been able to write these yourself. I would say the most important thing for me is to keep the dialogue going with our federal partners. NIH and NSF have been so willing to listen to our perspective on this and to try to understand the cultural issue that we're talking about. They have been very helpful and indicate they wish to continue. I want to point out to you also just on this, that we would need help in order to do this in accord with regulation. We would need help from federal agencies. There are always going to be, but particularly in the early years of this, there will be a need to contact somebody and simply ask a question and get a response. As always, I think we want to do it right. We're just not sure how. So let me open it up to this group and see what other thoughts you might have about how we manage this, how we begin to parse it into working points.
Lily, did we get anything in chat that people would like to talk about?
Not yet, but as a reminder, everyone, if you'd like to put your questions or comments in the chat, or you can also go into the participants list and select the little blue hand and we can call on you.
So my feelings are not hurt. I assume we just covered it so clearly. There's no need for questions. But Susan and I will be around towards the end if there's time for discussion then. Thank you very much.
So we have a question now. Have the FDP's federal partners explained how they see the expansion of disclosures contributing to reducing foreign influence? i.e., do they expect the results to be provided to law enforcement or fines for noncompliance?
Well, that's certainly a chilling question. There has been no discussion of that at all. And I think that is, I certainly hope that is a far leap from where we are in simply understanding what we need to report.
What did the federal partners say about institutional responsibility? Are the institutions responsible to assure accurate submissions of other support?
We're going to be talking about that here in a minute.
Yeah. I think that's pretty clear, but I'm going to let my colleagues answer that one later because it's coming right up.
Yeah. Okay, next slide.
There was a question on MITRE. Somebody want to answer in chat? You see that?
Yeah, so someone's asking what the MITRE acronym means. MITRE is an organization.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we also have another question. Should faculty of international origin be concerned?
Well, I'll take that. This is Jim. I'll take that one. I mean, as you saw in some of my opening comments, that has been a very significant concern. There were articles in Nature and Science about international researchers that weren't coming to the U.S. anymore. Instead, they were diverting to Europe and other places. And I think both, certainly the MITRE report, the OSTP early guidance was suggesting that that would be a disaster for U.S. research if that continued on a large scale. So I think there's a lot of concern there. And I think some of the plan changes are trying to mitigate and reduce that risk.
You know, I know we're going to have to move on because we want to make sure all the topics get covered, but if we missed your question, we'll either pick it up at the end in the Q&A if we have time, or we will gather that and collect it for later use by the big group. So, okay, I think, Doug, I believe you have the next segment.
Okay, thanks, Pamela. The first issue that and challenges that we have are related to federal agencies. They currently have inconsistent requirements, and it is difficult to institute and enforce rules with inconsistent FCOI policies. For example, NSF currently says current and pending support information includes all planned, pending, and current projects and in-kind support that is either provided directly to the individual or to the individual through their organization in support of the individual's research endeavors. Where NIH says income, salary, consulting fees, and honoraria in support of an individual's research endeavors. And NIH requires the disclosure of all research support, including other support, foreign components, in-kind, and other resources. So this is definitely a challenge for all of us to make sure we have harmonization. Another issue is the outside commitments. And as Kim was making comment about, outside commitments were not necessarily considered FCOI, and therefore they're not consistently reported. I know that at my institution, faculty have certain types of activity that's a part of their assignment, service component, and so they were not reporting it on the FCOI, and that included courtesy appointments as well as consulting. So it is going to be a challenge to make sure that faculty report in the FCOI process separate from what they're doing from their academic activity, and this is going to be a challenge. Also, many institutions treat FCOI compliance separately and distinct from pre-award staff and systems, and it's going to be a challenge to integrate them. So as all of you know, we have pre-award, post-award, the compliance, the departmental administrators, and connecting all of those dots just for FCOI alone is a challenge. Another area is confidentiality. FCOI disclosures and determinations are typically treated confidentially and shared with a limited number of systems. For us at the University of Central Florida, some of our questions include nepotism. They include financial information, and it's not readily available to just the general administrative groups that would be normally interested in this information. So we have to come up with a process to make sure that all of the other administrators and people who are interested in the outcome of these disclosures have the information. And that's going to be a challenge for us, and perhaps it's a challenge for you. And then finally, on the issues and challenges is the FCOI reporting cycles. And Jim made a comment about this as well, because the cycles and the systems do not always align with grant reporting requirements or timelines. I know, again, at our institution, they report this annually and they're supposed to update it, but it rarely coincides with a proposal that's just going out or award that was finally made, perhaps even 12, 18 months later. So it's always going to be a challenge to make sure on the time cycles. Next slide, please. So from a recommendations point of view, we have to recognize privacy issues that institutions will face, clearly articulate the purpose for use of the information that's disclosed. Number two, we need to establish clear and unambiguous definitions, descriptions that all parties understand. I think this is critical. Number three, we need to consider the complexity of evaluating unpaid positions, affiliations, which are outside of the FCOI requirement. Four, as has been said by many of us, we need to harmonize the requirements across the agencies. I think it would go a long way for all of us and help faculty to understand what are the consistent definitions that we all need to adhere to and to require faculty to disclose. And finally, we need to understand timeline needs for the new or substantially altered systems. So those are the recommendations. And if there's any comments, I'd be more than happy to address them.
Yeah, so we did get a couple questions. The first one is, faculty by discipline are routinely involved in large-scale international research, international ocean drilling efforts that involve federal support, but also participation and support from other nations. China is always a big player in ocean drilling efforts and other initiatives. How can such interactions and their downstream effects, i.e. continued collaborations with colleagues from these efforts, and all this may involve, be suitably communicated and managed?
Well, I guess the first comment I'd make is that if these activities are a part of funding through the university, then they obviously would have been disclosed. But if these endeavors include outside activity, that's exactly what we're talking about. For our university, any outside activity, especially foreign, would now require to be disclosed and have disclosure parameters around them. I think part of the challenge at our university is faculty having to report so many different activities, both as a part of what they consider their public service component, as well as what I would call paid outside activity. So every institution has to have a requirement for disclosure, and the difficulty is what to be disclosed and how to be disclosed. So I don't think I have a complete answer for it. I think that's part of what the working group is involved in, but perhaps this discussion is the start.
Great. So another question was, any discussion about the conflation of pending and other support data, which by definition are not the same as FCOI regulatory requirements for NSF or NIH?
I think this is another excellent point about connecting the dots. For example, my office is involved in FCOI, but we're definitely not involved in current and pending. So how do we connect those? And how do we make sure that, as an example, the departments and the faculty are properly disclosing activity to include foreign activity in their current and pending, and that is consistent with any activity that they should be reporting based on institutional policies in their FCOI. So there needs to be a connection of the dots, and that's where the systems need to connect, and departments and centralized departments need to talk. And again, I think that's why this dialogue is so important that we are discussing.
Great.
I think, Doug, this is Jim. I think the only thing I'd add to that is the question about kind of merging together other support, current and pending, and COI and FCOI, I think is a great point, right? That became clear in NIH's Protecting U.S. Biomedical Intellectual Innovation website they created with that grid. And I think their goal there was to try to be comprehensive. I do think they've gotten feedback to say, is it conflating those two things in a way that's confusing to institutions? And I know Koger has had conversations on behalf of institutions about, is there a better way to make sure that that was not trying to attempt to formally merge those concepts, and that document evokes some questions. So I think it's clarifications we'll see in the future.
It's a good point.
I was just going to add, Jim, that I think we're really at the point where we're saying, should those two be merged? Because there are a lot of consequences if we decide to open up financial conflict of interest information to people who are reviewing grant proposals. Is that actually the intent of our federal partners? And let's think about what the implications would be.
I think that's probably the perfect lead into the next topic. So thank you, Kyo. That's ideal. If we could go on to the next slide. So one of the things that was very clear, building on what Kim said earlier and what she just said, is that we gather data for different purposes at the institution. And there are no national standards right now that exist about what data ought to be collected. But you see on the slide some of the things that people collect for different purposes. We'd probably add to that, in some cases we have state rules that require collection of certain information that has to be looked at. And certainly information is collected from faculty or about faculty that's used for tenure and performance appraisal processes, or adherence to institutional policy, or to help with career advancement types of things. And so really the breadth of where this potentially could go is very broad, and we want to understand where it ought to go for the purposes of foreign influence. I think one thing we have to recognize as well that the group discussed was the culture within our institutions is not all the same. There's a lot of variation. Some institutions do have this kind of, I own you as a professional for their faculty or for their researchers. I think about that as I own you lock, stock, and barrel, right? Whereas many other institutions, my own included, simply really reflects the academic culture of your appointment details what we expect from you. We need you to teach, we need you to do research, we need you to do service obligations. And frankly, once you've done those things, that's fine. You have met your obligation to the university, and we are not necessarily reaching out into the rest of your life in terms of what it is that you're doing. Also, we recognize that even with all these different data systems, the data comes in a lot of different ways. There is no, and Lori's going to talk about this, there's no commercial system that does all this. Who gets the data within the institutions varies tremendously. It could be a department head. It could be a central office. It could be a provost, a dean, departmental research administrators, central research administrators, specialty offices like a conflict of interest office or a provost office. So the variety of players is also very wide. It can even be libraries in terms of things like publication information, for example. And some of that information doesn't even come in from a system perspective. It could be an email. It could be a conversation that the faculty member has with his or her department head. So how to intersect all those dots is actually tremendously difficult. Next slide. So some of the recommendations that we made for those of us that are chronologically advantaged may remember the days where the federal government, NIH in particular, gave out awards to help expand the value of IRB systems and to be able to put in more comprehensive IRB systems. Well, we thought, that could be another model here, that the federal government could actually go out if they were able to do this and award one or more grants to collect more information about just how difficult this is, or what models might effectively be used and redeployed. We have said previously on previous topics here, so much of this belongs about clarity and about unambiguous definitions. We have to be able to help faculty understand what their obligations are. And we have to know ourselves in order to create systems that would allow that to occur. I think the last point I would make here is that the timing of data collection is important. First of all, there's timings just related to the grant process that need to be taken into consideration. The fact, for example, that proposals also often, always run up to the last minute. And so the ability to make sure that information that's necessary for proposal review is there in time is important. But oftentimes our conflict of interest practices, for example, don't have timing that necessarily intersects or relates well with the life cycle of a grant proposal or award. And that's true for some of the other kinds of annual faculty activity reporting as well. So there's an issue about making sure that the timing for data is viable for all of the partners. And there's also the issue about timing of if standards are going to change, expectations are going to change, then we have to have sufficient lead time in order to be able to bring that all to bear. So again, this is something that hopefully when we were able to talk with NIH and NSF about this, we were able to help them understand a little bit more about the intensity of the complexity that goes along with all of this. I'll stop there and see if we have any questions or additional items that people would like to add to the list that we ought to be considering.
So it seems like there's a little conversation going on about publications. How should collaborators' funding for a publication be reported in an investigator's current and pending?
Well, and I think part of that goes back to what's the purpose needed for that disclosure? Can we help faculty understand very clearly why, and this goes to the third bullet here, what data elements belong to what purpose? And so if there's a need for that information, how are we going to use that information? How are federal agencies going to use that information? Because right now we have, of course, the general understandings that that it's important to report to federal agencies how their federal funding has been used and the value that that's brought, including advancing science in general. So one purpose for denoting publications and assigning them to grants. But I think the question goes far beyond that in terms of how's that information going to be then used, right, in terms of federal agency review. And I assume that's what the purpose of that question is. So, and I don't know, I don't think we have a lot of these answers yet. That's part of this whole goal, is to say, let's articulate what those data elements look like. Let's understand how they're being used. And let's focus their use for that particular purpose.
Okay, great. So it seems feds have used publication information, acknowledgements, citations, and affiliations to indicate a lack of reporting in other C&P support. Can you comment on if this is being considered in the risks to institutions in the white paper?
Run me through that one more time, Lily, because I'm not quite understanding the question.
It seems feds have used publication information, acknowledgements, citations, and affiliations to indicate a lack of reporting in other or C&P support.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's, I think Pam's going to talk a little bit about that, in fact, next, in the context of publications are being used as a cross-check in some cases by federal agencies to verify whether or not there actually is international work or international collaborators going on. And I think that what we've found is that some of that can be very confusing, because what an agency might interpret to be, oh, no, you have a foreign component and you didn't report that foreign component, is actually independent allied research that may be going on with a different fund source. And then the investigators involved are choosing to do a joint publication. And again, that goes back to kind of understanding what should and shouldn't be reported. We do know also that some faculty are generous in terms of what they cite as being grant support on their publications, and can sometimes cite grants without there being a highly defined connection between the funding that went on for that grant and what was in the publication. And that may also inadvertently, for all good, well-meaning reasons, end up causing some questions downstream. I think we're probably—
Hey, Pamela, this is Jim.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say very briefly, Stephanie's question that you just answered is kind of at the heart of what we're talking about, right? We know early on that NIH, with coordination with the FBI. That's some of how those 300 or 400 letters were identified to go out. And so what do we do with them, right? If they happen during their outside activities, if they happen in consulting, if they're employment relationships, and that is at the heart of the issue. And then my last comment is what Kim Moreland opened up with, or finished as her final recommendation, which was federal agencies should have resources to assist in advising throughout the grant lifecycle and making determinations of compliance.
Yep.
Right? We're being left to our own devices to understand all of the complexities that we're talking about. So that's a perfect illustration of why we're having this conversation.
Yep.
Thanks, Pamela.
And I think what Pam is going to say next is also going to add very much to this conversation. So next slide, Pam.
Great, thanks, Pamela. Hi, everyone. Yeah, great, here we are. So I think this is the perfect topic on this slide, pitting the institution against individual faculty. I mean, as we've heard from all of the speakers so far, so much of this is just, we want to understand what we should be doing and how to do it, and hopefully we will do it, even though it will be difficult and we need time to set that up. But in the meantime, it's really difficult. I think we're all in these roles and offices where we pride ourselves in helping the faculty, helping them understand what they need to do, helping them get their proposals out the door completely and compliantly and timely. And now all of a sudden we're in a very different role where we're trying to tell them to do things differently. And of course, as most faculty, they say, where do we see that in writing? We want to know where does it exactly say this is what I want to do? And we don't have that anymore. You know, there are areas where we're trying to interpret, whether it's the matrix, someone was mentioning earlier about the conflict of interest versus pending support, and where something was published and then taken back. And even what we have now is not very clear for us to show our faculty the way that they're going to really look at it. One of the things that worries me is, one, they're angry. They think we're overinterpreting the rules, you know, I'm sure we're all accused of doing that at times, but it also in some areas gives a loss of confidence in our offices and what support we can provide. I have a new boss, well, new as a year ago. And at first he would say to me, well, you just need to be able to have the answer. And the more we talked about it, and the more he looked at it, he now never says that to me anymore, because he understands that we're always trying to interpret what something means, and it's so case specific. So that has been very difficult for us. The seat change that it talks about, everything is moving very quickly. We're asking people for information that they thought was private, you know, and trying to help them decide what is consulting and what is research. And when we go back to some of our funding agencies and say, well, we didn't know about this, they're saying to us, well, you should have known. And I would say most of my colleagues on this call a year ago would have also said, no, we don't know. And so how to make it look like we're good professionals to our faculty, but also that we are doing the right thing to the, you know, in front of the funding agencies. So all of that has been difficult. There was an earlier question about targeting faculty, and that's certainly a question that we have had coming from some of our faculty that we've had to interview. And we try to assure them that we are not targeting them. And I can say that based on the people that we've looked at, it's been a broad spectrum of faculty. It has not, that we have not found that we are having for any reason to focus on a particular nationality or anything else. But that doesn't mean it doesn't feel that way to a faculty member when they're sitting across the desk from me and general counsel asking a million questions about what did they do. And the other thing that I think we worry about too is that we have had actions taken by our federal agencies, and we're not necessarily sure all of the information behind the action that was taken. And again, I know this is across the country where sometimes an award is stopped or held up, but we're not really told what the cause for that is. And again, when we can't explain that to our faculty, again, we're caught in the middle there. And the last bullet here too about investigating claims, it absolutely causes disruption to their lives of the investigators and their labs and their science. And we're not finding a way to do this quickly and nimbly. And some things that we have just lingered for way too long for all of us. So those were the areas that we really had issues and challenges in trying to support our faculty. I think we can go to the next slide. And I think a lot of our recommendations are all similar to each other in each of these areas. You know, if they could just harmonize and really clarify the requirements and help us and understand what the investigative process should look like. I mean, they certainly do that around scientific misconduct. Not that that's easy either, but we have timeframes put in place. If they could, the federal agencies could partner with us in designing these processes and approaches. Absolutely low risk issues, we should be able to let people continue on their research. It shouldn't be where they just come in and stop our research without us understanding why. And also recognizing the differences in all of our institutions. At a private institution, we keep things more privately. You know, we have more privacy. We don't have to follow all the open records rules. It may be different with public institutions, and just understanding how our institutions work. And I think all of these span each of the topics that we've talked about. So that's what I had to say on that. I know that we're short on time, so are there questions that are coming in, Lillian?
Yes, we've had a couple questions. The first one was more of a comment regarding the timing of data collection. Sponsors need to be allies in allowing institutions time to appropriately collect, review, and verify the information. Often we are given a deadline by the sponsor's grants manager or program officer to return JIT documents, agreements, etc. within a short window. And of course, our faculty pressure the central office to submit prior to allowing sufficient time to adequately review.
I think we're in agreement with that, but you said that was just a comment, not a question, correct?
Yep. And then so we have another one. State IPRA laws are not so generous redaction-wise and may compel disclosures of information that can paint a target onto a researcher once his or her cumulative information is collected and then released. I'm especially concerned about researchers who do not restrict research that does not rise to the level of classified. And then we have another question here. How are others addressing their legal department question about foreign influence laws and enforcement, anticipating disclosure and HR lawsuits?
How are we approaching it? I'm hoping I'm answering that last question. I mean, for us, we work very, very closely with general counsel. Other than someone who's just coming to us with some general questions about other support, if we have any concerns, we have a group that meets every other week. It includes myself and sponsor program, general counsel. And so we're pretty much in lockstep the whole way to understand whether or not there are HR concerns, but they know what we're doing up front.
So this is Kim. I would just say that when I look at the chat, I see fascinating questions that are being raised, but that we can't possibly respond to today, because I think it's important that you hear the other topics. But it does seem to me that we need to consider a session that has more open time for interaction at the May FDP meeting.
And also, since you're talking about the chat, also the note from Michelle about that FDP does not make these recommendations per se. Right.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. I just wanted to make sure that people understand that there's a conversation we've been invited to participate in with our federal partners so that we can all better understand how these issues are impacting institutions. So we are using language of recommendation simply to talk about and distill what the institutional perspective is on these issues in the context of this iterative discussion. We will have to have a dialogue But ultimately, the FDP, as you all know, and I just feel it's important to remind us, is a neutral organization because we're a partnership with our federal partners. So I think we just want to make sure everybody is clear on that point. Thank you so much.
And Michelle, that's a great segue because I think you're up next. So
there might be one before us. I don't want to step on topic number 5.
Sorry. Yes, you're right.
Next slide. Yeah, I think it's Alex.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think it's Lori. Yeah, thank you. So.
No problem. I know we're running short on time, but I just kind of want to summarize and restate the problem that has been expressed many times over the different topic areas we've covered this morning. And that's that a lot needs to be worked out before any series of technological solutions could be valuable in this field. We've talked about and shown through the Coger slide that we all have different ways of handling this information to the extent we gather it. So that's different systems, both electronic and paper, different offices across our campuses and research foundations, which may be completely separate legal entities depending on who we are. And the people in those areas don't have access to all the same set of information. And that is by nature of their position. That could be by nature of the culture of the institution, could be by the nature of the confidential nature of the information, but we are not all seeing the same thing for a number of different reasons. So in order to sort of triangulate and find this information that may live in many places inside our own systems, including external systems. I mean, we talked a little bit before about publications and surfing things like Google Scholar or the other subscription services that we may have access to as institutions to figure out what our faculty are doing. And that's not even including the foreign translation services we may be purchasing for all those things that are not in English. So the significant investments in technology are necessary to pull all of this together in the absence of very clear, unambiguous direction on where we're going. Because right now we are just triangulating with a bunch of things that don't live in the same Venn diagram or only intersect in tiny places. Many of us obviously don't have giant budgets to handle this, and the pandemic did not make that problem didn't solve that problem for us. It made it a lot worse. And we don't have, no commercial system exists to handle this. But the reality in all of this is that good technology and good systems can't be designed if we can't design the problem. And right now we don't always know what we don't know, and a system's not going to know what we don't know either. So next slide, please. So like you've heard many times this morning already, is what we're really looking at is if reporting requirements are consistent and harmonized. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's using the same term to define the same thing, but that we understand both from a person perspective to explain it to faculty, but also a system perspective in a crosswalk. We know what things kind of mean the same thing and where they differ among federal agencies, just the way we do in preparing a proposal application. We've also asked them to consider, Pamela mentioned earlier that there was a way of providing grants to institutions to handle the IRB issue in the past. So if there were ways for us to develop proof of concepts to connect these dots, that would be really helpful in getting us there. And of course, time is always important, as is acknowledging that there are many of us out there, institutions of varying size, of varying reporting responsibilities, private and public, and that are not universities at all. And we will come up with different ways to handle this for our population. And I would ask if there are any other questions of the group and if Alex wanted to add anything else.
No, I think you covered it very well, Lori. Thank you.
As of now, there are no comments in the chat.
Great, thank you. With that, I will turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you. And I'm joined by Laura McCabe as well. I wanted to provide a little bit of a faculty-centric perspective on this issue because I think it highlights how complicated it is to come up with a set of solutions to the disclosure requirements and to the management requirements surrounding faculty engagement. And I think we have to begin with an understanding that faculty are trained at the onset of their careers think about how to engage in both the cultural and the knowledge base of different settings around the world. It starts from the DNA of you have to learn a separate foreign language often to get a degree. And that opens you up to a set of international networks often in your field. That means your entire training as a faculty member is sort of grounded in an idea of open science, open interaction, and open engagement with the ideas, not only of the scholarship in our US academic experience, but in other parts of the world. And so for a lot of faculty, I think it's just really a disconnect intellectually to try to figure out how to disclose what is baked into your already existing profile as a faculty member versus what your relationships are. And although it may seem very discrete from a grant perspective, in which I might have a collaborator in another institution that has funding on my grant, and then that's a very clear case of a disclosure, it might not be as simple as that for a lot of faculty. And part of that has to do with a second role that we play, which is the deep ways in which we are involved in training a next generation of scientists, many of whom are part of our international interactions. And so these two things really kind of make it complicated for faculty to know sometimes what they're supposed to be disclosing, when they're supposed to be disclosing, which part of what I do, particularly if their identity as a scholar is kind of forged in this internationalization. And then I think a third thing that is important to think about from a faculty perspective is that we're encouraged often by our institutions to build these ties with other institutions and with communities of scholars outside of the range of our own institution. We are often encouraged to disclose intellectual property. Sometimes the disclosure of intellectual property means we're protecting that property in international markets. And all of that to suggest that faculty are involved in this very sticky set of relationships. And it's just not always as discrete, easy to be discrete about, or I should say to differentiate which things belong on a disclosure and which things don't. I want to make sure that Laura has a chance to comment on that as well, because I think she also has additional perspectives.
Sure. I think that was great, your points, Michelle. And I would just add that it's true as researchers going out to meetings, you interact, you can predict of the 10 or 15 interactions that you're having with people in the US and internationally, which will end up being resulting in a publication. So how do you know when to disclose? When is it really the interaction? When is it a pilot study? Do I have to list everybody I know on these reports? You know, it becomes confusing, and having the requirements in some clear language would be very helpful for faculty. So clear language for the feds, for administrators, and for the faculty. I think this is one of the things that comes to my mind is we all need to understand each other on this topic, because each group can't do it alone. No one can understand an individual faculty's complex relations with everybody in the research.
I would encourage people to think about the faculty experience with respect to this issue as something akin to being at the bottom of an upside down pyramid, in which the faculty member is supposed to push information out to a myriad of sources, which, if they're not harmonized with each other, means you're making decisions in every disclosure about what belongs in that particular information request. And because there are so many of them, it's also very hard for an individual faculty member to be consistent across all of those disclosures. And because they're happening in different timelines, it changes. And because of the fact that it's a dynamic environment in which those disclosures might be correct today and not correct tomorrow, I think that becomes a real issue for the faculty. So we're on that page of harmonization. Pamela, I turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to advance to the next slide at all, Michelle, or do you think you've got?
Yeah, I don't think I can move the slides.
Okay.
I think that has to be Lily or Edgar.
There you go. So, was there anything on here, Michelle, that you wanted to talk more about?
Oh, I think we were just saying that our idea was that harmonization of requirements is very helpful to the faculty perspective. And that I think there's another concern that is important to keep in mind, that a lot of faculty do all that they can to be on the right side of the reporting requirements and of the information, of providing information that's asked of them. But they're not always sure that they have it straight. And so there's a lot of, anxiety in this space. That's what I experience in my day job at Temple University. There's just a lot of anxiety, and I think for the rank and file faculty who is kind of doing all they can to be consistent and not make mistakes and all the rest, there's a big concern out there that somehow they would get swept up in a sort of assessment of the institution that doesn't take that into account. And that in fact, there may be a very small number of individuals that we do need to be managing, but the system that we're putting in place to do that management is so broad and sweeping, it may actually miss the real concern areas and instead just create this really burdensome environment for everybody. So translated into a kind of recommendation, it's just really trying to do all that we can to harmonize this and remember that burden component is always on faculty minds.
That's great. And I think not only helping faculty understand what they need to do, but helping reduce anxiety is certainly a role that we all want to play as research administrators.
I think anxiety pushes people underground.
Yeah.
or mobilizes them in ways that are, time consuming and not necessarily helpful to the task of doing what we need to do in the rest of our science.
Yep. Okay, we're going to move on now to our final topic, and one that I think is probably of universal interest. So, Jim?
Thanks, Pamela. It's a perfect segue from the faculty perspective, because we've talked about process, we've talked about technology, we've talked about the complexity of the dots, but it all comes down to an institution's culture and an institution's relationships with its faculty, which ultimately leads to, okay, how do we put accountability in this process? And Michelle, I think I opened up with it, but you echoed, and that is, there is no longer any disagreement that there is some inappropriate influence in some cases, right? So we didn't realize it 2 years ago. We all get it now, and now it's a function of how do we manage it in the least burdensome way. And so what this is about is we've talked about the fact that in a number of cases, faculty know things that the institution doesn't know. That's been the case for decades and decades about their outside activities, things that happen outside of their appointment period, consulting time, and so forth. So the question is, how much does that need to change so that there can be more accountability in the system and ultimately accountability for either the PI or the institution? And very briefly, because I do want to leave a couple of minutes, very briefly, NIH's website about protecting the grid, where they talk about this, has roles and responsibilities, and they say that it's institution's responsibility to work with the faculty to make sure that everything is accurate and complete. It goes on to talk about ensuring that researchers disclose appropriately and ensure that all reports and communications are accurate. There's been other discussions that Jean has led in some of her seminars for NSF that basically recognizes there are some things that the faculty report on their own and they have accountability. So we don't want to create an institutional relationship where we're pitting the faculty against the institution. We want to do this in the most harmonious way possible, the most effective way, the most least burdensome way. And that's kind of the gist of this. And if you can go to the next slide. And so the recommendations are to make sure that people understand, institutions and faculty understand what are their responsibilities, right? So we know that NIH may be asking for translated documents of relationships that may happen outside of the appointment period. As Pamela mentioned early on, or someone mentioned early on, many of us don't see many of those agreements. So how do we create this so that we can assist in that and make sure that there's appropriate accountability for the PI of the institution? So I won't go through each of these. I think this is between the faculty perspective, which was number 6, and this, it's the right one to end on. If you can go to the next slide, what I will briefly say, and then we can look at what's in the chat. When we had this listening session with the partners, we acknowledge that there's clear challenges on both sides and there aren't any easy answers, but that truly the FDP is kind of uniquely positioned to recognize the burden, leverage the relationship, and understand how we can do this most effectively. So this is the first of hopefully continued discussions, maybe some demonstrations as we get further into this. But we appreciate everybody's input. And I think, Pamela, we have 5 or 6 minutes to see if there's any finishing topics or questions.
I know we had one question on that came in about what do we think is going to happen after the presidential transition? And I guess I would answer that one by saying we have hopes, certainly in terms of certain things. What comes to immediately to mind, for example, are things like the very intense requirements around Department of Education Section 117 reporting, for example, or the fact that for Department of Energy, some Department of Energy basic research, fundamental research grants, we now need to get approval for international students to participate in those grants. And I think we're all aware that the topic isn't going anywhere. And it has nothing, that's not going to be dependent on who is in office. But how we approach the topic, we're all interested to understand and try to at least reflect what we all believe about the importance of making sure that the richness and the healthy aspects of all of our international collaborations and students are able to be continued. So I don't know if anybody would like to add to that. No? Okay. Lily, are there other items from the chat that we can address in the last 4 minutes that we have together?
Yeah, so there were a few questions we didn't get to. So one was the panel's going really well. Can you guys talk about what you're doing at your institutions to meet all the requirements we've discussed? How are you doing it? Any tips that you have specifically for the group? Can you tackle this one?
Well, I'll just get it started and then people can talk about what they're doing. I think that our struggle right now is to understand really what the requirements are. And so we are publishing among our institutional members the need for reporting and emphasizing all resources, and that if in doubt, report it. Use one of the tried and true mechanisms, whether it's other support, conflict of interest, the progress report, whatever it might be. But we are not making serious changes at this point, waiting for better guidance that I think will be coming from our federal partners.
Hey, Kim, this is Jim. The only thing I would add to that is we have a group of 3 or 4 of us and that kind of triage these. And the primary points of contact are really trying to be open to promote the discussion, right? We don't want to be a barrier. We don't want to be punitive. We don't want to be overly enforcing, because it is in very much a stage of people are socializing. Well, what exactly do we mean by that, from the faculty to administration? So I think that's the most critical thing, because someone has said, if not, it will either drive it underground or it'll frustrate the faculty to such a degree they'll throw up their hands and say, you know, I can't get my work done. So we've tried to be very open to advise, and there's a handful of people at Duke that are really on point for doing that.
I think some of
I could
us.
say at Johns Hopkins, oh, sorry, Pamela.
No, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say at Johns Hopkins, what we've, you know, and just like Duke, we're a large institution and historically have been very much decentralized, even at the policy level, making sure that we had a threshold of what the policy was, but there weren't always consistency across the entire enterprise. And what I've seen in the last year or two, particularly with our conflict of interest policy, our visitors policy, and appointments policies, we're working to make sure that we have one central policy, because I think it makes it easier for everybody to understand what the requirements are. And it's absolutely easier for the faculty because they're only dealing with one policy rather than possibly several, depending on how many appointments they have across the institution.
And I guess I would just end with, I think a lot of us are looking at our forms, and whether that be conflict of interest, commitment, proposal routing forms, to see, could we do a better job asking questions, or are there questions on our forms that we know we ought to be asking that maybe we never have thought of in the past? I know 3 years ago, if you had said foreign talent recruitment program to me, I'd say, what's that? And so I think those kinds of things are, we may not necessarily know quite yet what to do with the answers, but knowing if there are obvious questions that perhaps we should be including to try to get enough information that we can then turn around and act on that information. I think we're at least getting the ball rolling doing that. But being, as Kim said, stopping short, for example, of doing major system changes when we might have to do those all over again. So, Jim, any final words? Or Lily?
No,